Hello everyone, Professor Wolf here. I'm making this video for students in my Net World Religion class at College DuPage in fall 2025. This is going to be a short video on Sufism. We're entering into week 8. I've assigned you, in addition to a selection from our textbook on Islam, a chapter on Sufism by Christopher Melkert, who actually is a specialist on Islamic law, teaches at Oxford. So that article, it's taken from the Cambridge Companion to Sufism. It'll give you an overview of early Sufism. And in addition to that article, I have assigned you some selections of Sufi poetry. And just to help orient you to all this, I want to talk with you a little bit about it. The Melkert article will help. I'd like to offer some remarks to help you with Melkert and help you with the poetry. So as Melkert will discuss, there's a lot of different ways of thinking about Sufism. And that's due in large part to the fact that Sufism is complex. It's not simple. It's not single. It's not a monolith. Different Sufis have conceived Sufism in different ways and approached it in different ways. Often Sufism is described generally as Islamic mysticism, or at least as one major strand of Islamic mysticism. Now, whenever you hear scholars make general pronouncements like this, Sufism is Islamic mysticism, there's always some scholar who wants to challenge that and say, now that's too simplistic. You know, we need to recognize more complexity here. We need to complicate this a bit, problematize it a bit, okay? And if you read through the other articles on Sufism in the Cambridge Companion to Sufism, you'd find at least one article that does precisely that and says we shouldn't call it Islamic mysticism, that's too simplistic. I'm actually okay with this. I want to recognize that there could be forms of Islamic mysticism outside of Sufi traditions, but as much as I myself like to challenge generalizations, I think sometimes they're actually good. Sometimes they fit. Critique everything, including the critique, right? And sometimes, you know, what scholars yesterday told us actually still holds up pretty well today. I'm actually totally fine with describing Sufism as Islamic mysticism. But then we have to clarify what we mean by mysticism. This word gets interpreted in a lot of ways. Some of us, once we hear the word mysticism come up in conversation, we start thinking about, you know, magic crystals or green tea or things like that. And actually, I myself, I love green tea, but I don't so much go in for magic crystals. But, you know, and I'm sure there's some Sufis out there, right, that drink green tea, certainly other forms of tea. But we're not really talking about, you know, magic crystals here. What are we talking about? Like, what does mysticism mean in this context? What the term mysticism often means for Jews, Christians, Muslims, you know, Hindus, Sikhs, and others. And yes, this is an English word. And yes, you know, might not always have, you know, anything like a perfect analog in Hebrew or Arabic or Sanskrit or whatever. But what we're really talking about here is the idea that, at least when it comes to God, there are forms of non-theistic mysticism. Let's not focus on that here. We're talking about Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Sikhism, and at least for many, many, many Hindus who believe in God and even one God. What we're talking about when we talk about mysticism is the idea that we not only want to believe in God, but to know this God, to encounter this God. Christians often use the language of a personal relationship with God, a personal relationship with Jesus, right? That language of personal relationship is not always used in other traditions, but many Sufis are quite comfortable with that, or if they don't use the exact language of personal relationship with God, they'll often talk about being a lover of God. And actually one of the names of God in Islamic tradition generally is al-wudud, the lover. Okay. Now I should caution you. Like I know some Sunni Muslims, very devout, very knowledgeable, very wise, very cautious, who would say they're not comfortable with the language of having a personal relationship with God. One individual I know says he wouldn't reject the language and say it's bad or wrong, but he says that we don't find that language in the Quran or in the Hadith that he recognizes. So he'd want to exercise caution about that language, right? But still would recognize, yes, the Quran, Hadith speak of developing, of drawing near to God, God being near to us, okay? Many Sufis are just going to talk, they're just going to go full out and just talk about being a lover of God, just swept up in love for God, drawing near to God. Plenty be perfectly happy with the language of personal relationship, okay? Being a friend of God, a lover of God, a friend of God, a lover of God, a friend of God, a lover of God. Deep, 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 intimate love. Deep, 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 intimate love of God. Again, the idea being we shouldn't just believe in God, believe central, teachings of the faith, not just engage in central practices of the faith, but we should be seeking to know this God, encounter this God, to fall in love with this God, to be raptured by this God, not in this sense of being taken up into the clouds or something, but just like just like spiritual, like ecstasy, right? Being drawn out of ourselves into God, or maybe even in a way finding God in ourselves, maybe in a way kind of merging with God. I'll come back to that in a bit. Deep, deep, deep intimacy with God, being a friend of God, a lover of God. Okay, so this is something. Actually, before I go on, let me just mention one thing. Actually, and there are many Muslims. I want to talk about this. There are many Muslims that are not very keen on Sufism. There's some that kind of hold it at a cool distance. There's some that actually think it's deviant and dangerous and heterodox and heretical. It needs to be uprooted. And then there are many Muslims that it's the path, and it goes back to the Prophet Muhammad himself, and was taught by the Prophet Muhammad and encouraged by the Prophet Muhammad and his companions, right? So there's a lot. It's controversial in Islam. There's different views on it, but one thing that's not controversial in Islam, at least in Sunni Islam, I'll mention there's this hadith. These hadith are reports of things. We're talking about prophetic hadith now. There's different types of hadith. We're focusing on prophetic hadith, reports of things that the Prophet Muhammad said, did, and or tacitly approved or disapproved of. And there's disputes among Muslims about which hadith should be accepted, which should not, even within the same traditions within Islam, but certainly across them. So Sunni Muslims and different types of Shiite Muslims, they do not all accept the same hadith, but at least among Sunni Muslims, a well-known hadith is the Gabriel hadith. In Christian tradition, Jibril, is the angel who comes to Mary with the news that she is going to birth this Christ child. By the way, Islam also teaches that Jesus was born of the Virgin Mary, that Islam teaches that Jesus was a prophet, conceived by Mary as a virgin. Islam does deny, of course, that Jesus is God, and also denies that he's the Son of God. For most Muslims, God doesn't, you just don't speak of God having children, period, whether it's a prophet or not a prophet. Jesus wouldn't be the Son of God. Nobody would be the son of God or the daughter of God. God doesn't have spouses. God doesn't have children. God doesn't have partners, right? So Jews and Christians talk about, human beings being children of God, made in the image of God. Those really aren't Islamic doctrines at all. But Jesus is a prophet in Islam and born of the Virgin Mary in Islam. Okay. Which is sometimes really sometimes news to people. But at any rate, so in the Christian tradition, Gabriel is the angel that comes to Mary with the news she's going to bear the Christ child. And Gabriel, he plays important roles in Islam as well, mediates the revelation of the Quran to the prophet Muhammad, right? But also shows up in some hadith. And so there's this hadith, the Gabriel hadith, the Jibril hadith, where Gabriel comes to the prophet Muhammad while he is accompanied by some of his companions and interviews him about Islam, Iman, and Ihsan, right? And actually we can learn something really critical about Islam here. So we often call this religion Islam. We call it Islam, which means submission to God, also frequently connected with the root from which the word salam, peace, derives, and so often connected with the idea of peace, right? But we often call this religion Islam. Muslims often call it Islam, right? We call the individuals Muslims, those who submit. But in Islamic tradition itself, and we see this in this hadith, there is not just Islam, there is also Iman, and there is Ihsan, right? So in the angel Gabriel, interviews the prophet Muhammad about this. And what comes out of this hadith and other sources is that Islam is submission. It's your life conforming to God's guidance, God's expectations, God's law, if you want to put it that way, right? A Muslim then is one whose life conforms to God's expectations, guidance, laws in this way. That is Islam, that is a Muslim. But there's an understanding in Islam, as there is in all traditions, that your outward behavior, your actions, in a way the form of your life, can conform to the expectations of the faith without real belief, without real trust, right? And, well, there's this idea that you shouldn't just do the things, you should believe, right? You shouldn't just do them, you should really believe. And this is Iman, like faith. Also, in a way, commitment, right? Trust, okay? So, and those, the ones who don't just not just do the right thing, not just walk the walk and but talk the talk, who don't just do the things but really believe in it. We could call these believers, right? Which is a term that's used often in the Quran. There's a whole surah, chapter, if you will, of the Quran that's called the believers. The idea is they're not just submitting, they're not just following, but they're really believing. But then there's even a category beyond that of ihsan, which is often translated as excellence or striving, or just other translations of it. And the idea is that the individual who exhibits ihsan, they're not just doing what they're supposed to do and not just believing, but I believe in this Jibril hadith, it's explained as praying as if you see God even though you don't see him. It's like, one way to understand it is like this total inner commitment, this total inner conversion, this total living for God, living for the faith. Okay? Now, many Sufis would say, yeah, that's what we're after. And the way that we're after that is by being a friend of God, a lover of God, through having this profoundly intimate connection with God, this profound relationship with God, being deeply in love with God, which again, not all Muslims would prefer to put it like that, but there it is. But anyhow, let's move on a little bit to keep this, keep this relatively short. So if mysticism is the idea that we're not just going to do the right things and believe the right things, but try to really encounter God, even love God. Well, how do we do that? Well, that's where things get interesting. And what you see in a lot of religious traditions is you will have extra prayer, extra meditation, extra fasting, extra reading of scripture, so forth and so on. intense spiritual practices, often the spiritual practices everybody else is already doing them, but doing more of them. There is fasting in Islam. There is prayer in Islam. There's all sorts of traditions of fasting and prayer in Islam. Many Sufis would do those, but do more of them, do them more intensely. So you all are familiar, for example, with Salat. You might not know it by that name, but the 5 daily prayers, the 5 obligatory prayers in Islam. But there's all sorts of other prayers in Islam that one can do, right? And many Sufis, they'd want to make sure they engage in those extra prayers. So they want to, many Sufis, they want to spend a lot of time fasting, they want to spend a lot of time praying. They might stay up late into the night, reading the Quran, reading other sacred texts, which Muslims do, right? Sometimes some Sufis engage in additional ascetic practices, like spiritual practices, self-denying practices, that are not really done by mainstream Muslims. And sometimes mainstream Muslims are critical of that and sometimes not. Okay, one big split within Sufism I should talk about is the split between what we might call Nomian and antinomian Sufis. So the Nomian, antinomian here comes from a Greek word, a Greek root nomos, meaning law. To say that a certain religious tradition is antinomian means that it violates the law, or it's willing to violate the law, or set aside the law. The law is defined by who? Other folks in the religion. So there have been some prominent Sufis who've been antinomian. And what are examples? They have sometimes intentionally set aside the daily prayers, the obligatory 5 daily prayers. That's obviously going to bother a lot of other Muslims. Some have engaged in willful consumption of alcohol. That's going to bother some other Muslims. Some, I don't know if it's very many, but some, we can go on with this, right? You get the idea. There have been and there are a number of Sufis who are willing to bend or set aside certain key injunctions of Islamic law. We call those antinomian. They're like against the law. I mean, in a way, it doesn't mean they're completely against all of it or they don't subscribe to all of it, but they view it as something that even if authoritative can and maybe even should be set aside in certain circumstances. Sometimes there's this idea that if everybody follows the law strictly all the time, that could actually interfere with their ability to develop this love of God, and in that case, love of God should always win. Now, again, there's going to be a lot of Muslims that are going to have a lot of issues with that. It's important to stress at the same time, though, that many Sufis, they would reject antinomianism as well and be fully orthodox in their following of the law. And again, Sufism isn't just one thing. I mean, yeah, we can describe it as Islamic mysticism, or at least, an important strand of that, or strands of that. It's not just like one sect or group. It's more like a family or a family of families. It's complex. Something else that many, not all Sufis have engaged in is dancing, music, and the composition and listening to poetry. Sufi poetry is quite famous. I've given you selections of it to read. Many, many Muslims, I wouldn't even say just enjoy this poetry. It can be a lifeline, something that really helps you to come to know God and grow in relationship with God. All major religious traditions, and I would think probably all minor ones do at some point or other, they have mystical poetic traditions. There have been mystical Jewish poets, mystical Christian poets, mystical Islamic poets, Hindu poets, Buddhist poets, Sikh poets, right? And there's a lot of commonalities across them. I myself, I've been more interested in Hindu mystical poetry lately, and it's often really interesting to me to see how many similarities there often are with Islamic mystical poetry, but also some differences, right? And differences across different, Sufis and different Hindus, But poetry is often a key vehicle for mysticism, and it makes sense. I mean, I don't want to be too simplistic or reductionistic about poetry, but one thing that so much poetry does is help us to slow down, to not be so distracted, which the United States especially we are, and to just notice what's going on inside ourselves, in our environment, with other people, to be able to listen to God. Sorry, not all poetry is actually focused on God, but so much poetry it's helping us to enter into our own experience. I mean, some of it is actually, some poetry is focused on God, of course, but I don't want to suggest like all poetry is like focused on God. But so much poetry is trying to help us to get in touch with our own human experience, to see what's going on in us and other people, to understand like what it is to be a human, what it is to be in this world with all the joys and all the sufferings, right? Well, if we want to develop a relationship with ourselves or other people, and then with God, poetry is a natural vehicle for that. And for people who are really trying to follow a spiritual path, including one focused on God, there's often a lot of ups and downs and trials and travails of that. A lot of people who want to follow God, Jews, Christians, Muslims, Hindu, Sikhs, they could wrestle with doubts. Even when they're not wrestling with doubts, they could have various questions, confusions. Sometimes people who feel very connected with God still feel God very far. They could feel close to God and distant from God at the same time, right? And they can have questions about how close should I feel to God? Like, what role should feelings play in my spiritual journey? All these kind of things. And I'll say for myself, even though I don't identify as Muslim, I'm an Orthodox Christian, I have been reading Sufi poetry for, oh goodness, probably more than 20 years at this point. And I love it. And it's just been an enormous help to me in my own spiritual journey. And I would say that about many Jewish and Hindu poets, others as well. I think so much Sufi poetry is just utterly amazing. It's just so rich. I'm asking you to read some of this. I think a good question for all of us is, how do we access this? Well, if we're not familiar with poetry, it can be difficult. If we're not Muslims, it can be difficult. If we don't believe in God at all, it can be difficult. But I think it's okay. We can do difficult things, and difficult isn't always bad, And it is okay to just acknowledge that, we may just, I don't even feel a little nervous about engaging with poetry or a different kind of religious tradition. Or even if you're Muslim, you might feel, it might be a bit difficult for you because of misgivings that many, not all, Muslims have about Sufism. So let me say a few things about this and close up. I think the only way to start really being able to get into poetry is just to do it, and just to have confusion and just continue. If you are really interested in learning more about poetry in general, send me an email. I'll send you some recommendations. Actually, I'll go ahead and do that anyhow. I have some written up. I could send you all some general recommendations on poetry. If you're interested in Sufi poetry, I could send you more recommendations on that. I will do that. If you're interested in Jewish, mystical poetry, Christian, Hindu, Sikh, you name it, I'll send you resources on that. It's okay to feel bewildered at first. It's okay to feel like you're not sure what to do. If you're agnostic, atheist, or can follow a different tradition, or a Muslim, you're not too hot on Sufism, you maybe just try to focus on this just journey into the self, trying to just understand ourselves and other people. And again, we are so distracted today, even before phones, before the internet, before computers, we were pretty distracted. We are so distracted now. Again, one thing poetry can do is just help us to just quiet the noise and just get in touch with ourselves. What's going on in here? And that can be hard for us because a lot of us, we might have some joy and some gratitude. It can be really helpful to practice gratitude, by the way. There's data on that. And maybe we can even learn to practice joy, but a lot of us, we have a lot of anxiety, fears, tough, like wounds, grief, maybe even shame, tough. But I think such a beautiful thing, though, about the human experience. You don't have to be a Muslim. You don't have to be Arab. You don't have to be Persian. You don't have to be Indian. You could be an atheist, from New Jersey, whose family goes back to Sicily and only Sicily, when you read these poems from different times, different cultures, even different religious traditions, like often something stirs in us. And even if we find a lot of confusion, something responds. Humanity responds to humanity. And start a journey, right? Actually continue start a new stage of the one we've all been on. And reading novels, plays, are also great in addition to poems, painting, sculpture, music, art just offers us so much, right? Okay. History, all of that. Okay. So just last thing I'll say before wrapping up. So a lot of Sufi poetry has been written in the Persian language, some in Arabic and some in other languages as well. We often associate Islam with Arabic because of the Quran and other things. But Iran went Muslim very early on, and Iran, it's a diverse place, right? It's a diverse place linguistically today for sure, and it's not just Persian, languages and dialects that are spoken in Iran, but Iran is a very, very old civilization, and the Persian language is very old roots, and there was a strong, robust literary culture in Persian when Persia, became Islamic, and many of the great scholars and poets in Islamic civilization have been Persian ethnically or spoke Persian languages. So much Sufi poetry is in Persian, some form of Persian, some in Arabic and other things too. Unfortunately, Persian is a language not much studied in the West. And you got to be careful, actually, because a lot of translations of Sufi poetry that you find on Amazon or in bookstores are actually done by people who don't even know the languages. So how could you make a translation if you don't know the languages? Well, the most prolific translator of Sufi poetry is Coleman Barks. I think he doesn't actually read a word of Persian. I could be wrong, but I've heard this, and I know this is true for others. I think it's true for Barks. Many of these people, they don't know a word of Persian or Arabic. So how are they translating? They're getting older translations of these works into English and then just sprucing them up in ways that seem fit to them. Seriously. The original translations from which they're working were often not very great. Now, some of these people, I'm sure, are doing some kind of additional studies and things like that. So I don't want to make it sound like it's just, completely, random, what they're producing. But there can be issues with that. When it comes to the selections I've assigned you, the Rumi selections are done by a great scholar of Persian language and literature, Franklin Lewis. He actually, I believe, headed the program in Persian language and literature at University of Chicago until his death a number of years ago. He was a great scholar. He knew Persian very well. The Rumi translations come from him, right? Some of the other translations are a little spottier. I actually decided to give them to you anyhow, because even though many scholars would raise some issues about them, as I just did, there's actually a scholar, I think is at Rutgers, Jawid Mojdadi, who he's from Afghanistan originally, I believe, a great translator, Rumi. I heard him say once that he's fine with these other kinds of translations. They often capture, yes, they can introduce distortions, but they can also get people into Sufism. Many of them do capture the spirit of it. I think so many of those other, like the less scholarly, translations are really, I think they can get people into it. I think they can be quite beautiful. It is what it is. If this is something you're really concerned about, you can just stick to the Rumi ones, right? Or talk to me about it. But I would advise you to read them all. And if it's something that you really get interested in, you can come talk to me. And if you'd like to be put in touch with an expert on, Persian language, literature, or, Sufi poetry in general, I can do that for you. And just one last thing before I go, I sent out an email with a bunch of resources on Islam videos. There's a link in that list to a talk on Rumi and a reading of Rumi by one of the world's leading scholars of Rumi, who teaches at Duke, I believe. I'm Omid Safi. I really hope I didn't mispronounce his name. Really great scholar. Has written a lot of wonderful stuff. So you can also take a look at that that video, and that would definitely help you out with this. Okay, that's all I've got for today. Have a good week, you all. Catch you in the next video.